year, the Institute of Economic Affairs received a request to try and answer questions regarding the status of the Mitumba trade or secondhand goods in Kenya. And this was because soon after the pandemic was declared, and obviously the restrictions were announced by the Office of the President, the Ministry of Trade in turn, working together with the Ministry of Health, announced specific measures which were to impose a ban on the importation of Mutumba clothes. The idea being that they needed to be aware, or they needed to be certain that the use of Mutumba goods would not be one of the mechanisms for the spread of the SARS coronavirus too. So that's basically as it was. And then at the beginning of that time, many other countries actually, a few other countries in the world made similar announcements. And so what excited us as the Institute of Economic Affairs was to try and answer for ourselves whether this was one, a reasonable measure for the purposes of protecting health, but also whether there was a precedent for it. And in reviewing that, we asked a couple of questions, and obviously asked of us by the Mithuba Traders Association. There's an association it's a consortium of Mitumba traders who came to a forum that the IEA held, and among the things they were asking was whether these measures were sensible. So in that argument, in that moment, the IEA chose to actually carry out a study. And the objectives of the study, as you can see in the map before you, or rather in the presentation before you, were 5. One of those was to discuss the legal regime and politics of the regulation of Mutumba trade in Kenya. Secondly, we sought to answer the question, or rather to draw a power map of the various interests in Mutumba trade regulation. And the third was to quantify the size and the extent of Mutumba trade. So the size in terms of the volumes of imports, and the extent is basically what kind of who trades Mutumba, where, and questions such as that. The fourth question was basically to trace and illustrate the value chains of the Mutumba trade in Kenya. Because contrary to what we thought, which was basically that these are just simply clothes and sometimes footwear imported into the country, often what happens is that they're brought into the country in bulk, are placed before traders who then proceed to simply trade it. And we wanted to understand how is it connected to other sectors and other economic activities within the country. And finally, of course, the interest was to highlight the effects of Mutumba trade on the environment and Kenya's industrial development. So this was based on basically some kind of crowdsourcing, asking people, and these are the questions we were asked to respond to. So we carried out a study, and part of it was just basically our intention was to inform the discussions last year where, one, there was a ban, and then the president lifted that ban. And it took quite a while before that was effected, and new rules were drawn. So the interest of the IEA here is simply to ask ourselves as objective policy scholars, what exactly is the political economy around Mutumba trade in Kenya? And with me, my colleagues who carried out that study will be making a presentation of the study. So just before I ask my colleagues to do that, it will be 3 colleagues, that's Leo, Anna Grace, and Maureen. And then they'll get to the conclusions. What I'd like us to just note some few rules, very basic. One of them is that as the speakers come in, please keep your microphone and your camera switched off. And that way we can concentrate on the speaker, but more importantly, concentrate on the screen and on the PowerPoint presentation, because they have a couple of slides. And then secondly, if you have questions, we have a chat box, a conversation box. You can send a question up there. I'll collect them, and then we'll have an opportunity to have them answered at the end, or whether you have comments. And I'll also open up an opportunity, and you can raise your hands up here. Now, as part of interactions, we try to make it as interactive as possible. I think it's a democratic approach to see if anyone asks a question through the chat box or the conversation box, and you think it's a good question, you could give it a thumbs up or the love sign, and that will be my very crude way of using a democratic method to ask our colleagues to to respond to those specific questions. Now, so without further ado, I'll ask my colleague Leo to proceed with the first part of the study. So Leo, please go ahead.
Yeah, so my name is Leo Kemboi. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and so part of the section on the legal and regulatory regime was to look at the laws and regulations that allow the Mitumba trade in Kenya. So mainly, the first law was that we looked at was the Standards Act, and now that establishes the Kenya Bureau of Standards, because at that time, KEBS had introduced a ban on Mitumba trade, so that because there was some public discourse that this Mitumba could be spreading COVID. Generally, clothes could be spreading COVID, and I think that various studies were carried out globally, and that disapproved that notion. So part of the was to look at what KEBS, because KEBS, the Standards Act, CAP 496, establishes the Kenya Bureau of Standards, which make provision that all goods that are and commodities that are consumed in Kenya must be tested and approved by them. The second main law is the East African Community Customs Management Act of 2004, revised in 2009, because this law applies to all members of EAC, including Kenya, and it makes the provision for how customs, the management and administration of customs, and how they collect and the collection. So provides also for computation of those import duties on goods and exemptions thereof. Also, it prescribes various offenses related to imports of different commodities. So the second law is the Customs and Excise Act, and this one defines the import duty and specific rates to be imposed on the different categories. And in this case, for the textiles, and because we were focused on the used clothes and footwear, this was the section. Also, specifically for that, the Customs and Excise Act, Section 118 of that law provides for how the variation of various rates of duties on different goods is done, including used clothes. Other laws include now the Miscellaneous Fees and Levies Act, because as my colleague Anna would explain, that throughout the value chain process, there are at various stages some levies, apart from the main taxes, some levies and fees will be paid for import and export of these various goods. Also, another law is the Tax and Procedures Act of 2015. Now consolidates those procedural rules for administration of all taxes in Kenya to facilitate tax compliant and efficient collection of taxes. So, as you all know, that the Mitumba traders, they pay various kinds of taxes, and throughout the parliament in its wisdom decided to come up with the Tax Procedures Act, which it prescribes how the various taxes are administered. So the other laws, these are the major laws for the purpose of the presentation. The other major laws, including the VAT and others. So, and the second question now is, because at that time, the Mitumba Traders Association were interested in looking at the various stakeholders or actors in that either could in the industry and the power map. Now, this is what we undertook was what economists call the political economy analysis, to say that this is what kind of power that these actors have, and this is the interest, and this is the outcome that we are supposed the outcome that is supposed to be seen. For this case, at the center of the of the on the far right, there's the Mitumba Association at the center of the whole thing, because these are people who rely on this sector, the industry, for livelihoods. So the Mitumba Association, they have higher interest, which is, as you see, it's on towards 5, while their power to change, the power, for example, to like propose regulations, propose certain measures, or do some of the things that are required for the growth of industry is low. So we put it at -2. Then there is the importers who supply now the Mitumba traders in Kenya, and their power is a little bit, their interest and the interest is a little bit lower. The interest is a little bit lower at 3 for the than the Mitumba Association, and and their power is a little bit lower, -3, because these are importers. They could supply any market. For example, if you find importers, because because the Mitumba trade is a global value chain, and what owners of capital, because these are like owners of capital, do at any time is that where there are some regulations that are difficult to deal with, you take your capital where there's more return. So you can find, like, for example, in Asia, the emerging markets, there's a bigger population, and also incomes are a little better than this part. So the interest is a little bit low. So we have the consumers. Now, some of us that would like this kind of, like, who require, their power is lower, the interest is higher, but not higher than the Mitumba Association, but their power is lower, is the lower, their power to change these things is a little bit lower than the rest of the in the group. Then there is Parliament. The Parliament, their power to influence action for Parliament is higher, because they can, for example, pass resolutions concerning and their interest is not that bigger in the issue compared to actors who directly benefit from the trade. We've, at the highest point in the power map, we've put the Ministry of Trade and Industrialization, that they have the interest. Their interest is a little bit lower in their interest. Their power is very high, because they're the ones who proposed the regulation on the ban, and that their power is very high because they proposed the regulation of the ban, and used clothes could not come into Kenya. So they have a very high power. What is debatable is the interest. And then there's the Ministry of Health, because as we learned is that from the actors in the industry is that was a suggestion from the ministry as a part of the effort to fight COVID. So there are other actors like the Kenya Revenue Authority, and their power is a little bit higher, because the power to tax, the power, the constitution, the legal role for KRA is tax administration. So unlike the Ministry of Trade and Industrialization or Treasury, where they can make regulations, the KRA's role is only limited to administering that tax. And based on the forums that we held, that they have some considerable level of power, because the consumers, the traders, actually recognize that, and their interest in this trade is a little bit higher, because it's in their own interest to see more that the more revenue targets are achieved. Then we have the manufacturers and local designers. The local designers their interest in this kind of trade is a little bit higher because uh, uh, what we've learned from the value chain is that the Mitumba trade, some of the used clothes are used in the local design, the local design industry. I know most of you know, for example, like the question of curtains, those exotic curtains that come in as unfinished, and then the local designers here are able to finish them. So the next thing about the main point from to summarize the main point from this power map was to say, because at that time we were seeing different reactions from various players in the industry, both on the regulation side and the main actors. And what we came to the conclusion is that the people who are supposed to fight for that these various reactions is not coincidental, but it's because of different levels of interest and different levels of power that these actors have in the industry, and it has influenced the way the market is at present. So another question, when we were asked to, what part of the objective was to try and quantify the level, the size and the extent of the market. So the distribution of the total, this is what we call the aggregate demand, the distribution of total expenditure. So, and if you look at it in the 2019, the total private consumption was the 7.9 trillion. For the purposes of the study, we were looking at the clothing and footwear side, which is 2.5% of 7.9 trillion, which is 197 billion Kenya shillings. What we tried to search across globally, which is almost, so if Kenyans consume clothing and footwear, both new and used clothes, of 197 billion, which is almost 3.5% of the total private consumption. We asked ourselves the question that what happens globally. So if you look at countries like the US, they have 7% and more. So considerably compared, looking at the numbers and relative to Kenya's the size of Kenya's economy, Kenya's the consumption levels for this kind of clothing and footwear is not that bad, but so we're trying to quantify that section. As you can see, and this one is a reflection of income problem. You see that the 44%, almost 45% is food and beverages, and 6.4 is housing. So you look at the overall priority for consumption for Kenya, and you see that this is a reflection of the income levels where we are. So the second, another thing that we tried to do was to quantify the extent of the trade. So we looked at the volume of imports, and as you can see, from 2015 to 2019, it ranged from 111,000 tons to 185,000 tons in 2019. The value of those imports was ranged from 10 to 18 Kenya shillings, 18 billion. Stagnated between the volume of imports and the value stagnated between 2016 and 2017. So that is the overall picture of the extent of trade. So I want to let my colleague Maureen to take over from here. Maureen.
All right. Thanks, Leo. Anna, and yes, please go ahead. Anna, please introduce yourself and just go ahead.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Maureen from the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'll take you through the remaining charts. Okay, on these charts, we have the household expenditure on total clothing and footwear. Oh, sorry. Okay, we'll first look at the trend in Kenyan imports accounted for by the secondhand cloth industry, and we're looking at the Mitumba that are brought in as a percentage of the total value of imports. And in 2015, it was at 0.64%. In 2019, it was at 0.89%. 2017, it was at 0.75%. 2018, it was at 0.96%. And in 2019, it was at 0.98%. All across, you can see that the share of the total imports of secondhand clothes is at least 1% of the total imports that are brought in. And we can see that there's a dip in 2017, and the dip was brought about by convergence of drought and its effect on the domestic economy. We can see that the trade is also dependent on the domestic economy. The next chart is looking at the household expenditure on total clothing and footwear. There's a chart on the new purchases and the secondhand purchases of different households. On the new purchases, the household number was 74,986 with a median of 450 and a mean of 782.9. The median means that half of the new purchases made by the 74,986 was at 450 shillings, and the rest bought at above 450 shillings. And the expenditure was done between the ranges of 0 and 15,000 shillings. On the second chart, it's purchase for the second-hand purchases in households. It's across 52,209 households, and the median for the second-hand purchases, like what's half of those households on a range of 0 to 15,000 shillings bought was 280 shillings, and the average cost was 409 shillings, which is the mean. Okay, we'll go to moving on, we'll go to the next chart that describes the new purchases by residents. On this one, okay, before, on the previous charts, we are looking at all the households across that buy new purchases and second-hand purchases, and we are looking at 73.1 purchases that participated in buying the new purchases and 51.1% that bought the second-hand purchases. Okay, on this one, we'll diverge a little bit. We'll look at both the rural and the urban population, and you can see that at least 51.1% of households purchased an item with the median. Okay, half of the population purchased in the urban centers purchased clothes amounting to 500 shillings, and half of it in the rural areas purchased clothing amounting to 400 shillings. And you can see there's a disparity between the two. We can see in the rural areas, that's where they did most of the purchases for the new clothes, while in the urban, in the next chart, we look at the second-hand purchases. In the urban areas, half of the population purchase second-hand clothes for up to 300 shillings. And in the rural areas, they purchase clothes for up to 250 shillings within a range of 0 to 15,000 shillings across all households. Looking back at the 73.1% of all households, but we are decomposing the areas of residence in both the charts, the new purchases by residents and the new purchases in the urban and rural areas and the second-hand purchases in the urban and rural areas. We can see that the centrality of income in the purchase of second-hand clothing, and most of the rural areas, according to the level of income between the urban and the rural areas are the ones that did most of the purchasing according to the median, which is the half of the population purchased clothes up to 250 shillings for the second-hand clothing. My colleague Anna will take over from there.
Good morning. My name is Anna Grace, and I'll take you through the value chain of the Mitumba trade in Kenya. And just before we begin, we categorized the different activities in the value chain into two: the support activities and the primary activities. The support activities comprise of human resource administration, research and development, the procurement services, and the farm arrangement. And the primary activities include logistics, marketing and sales, and after-sales activities. So let me just go through step by step of what it takes for you to get your garment or your shoe from your soko, the second-hand market. It begins with importing. So these goods come in through, by flight, by ship. And on average, the Mitumba trade industry imports up to around 8,040 feet containers annually in Kenya. And as you can see, this is what is at step 2 at the port of Mombasa. So here you have clearing agents and the transporters, and these are jobs being created here. From there, they move from the port to now the trucks, It's put in they're loaded to the trucks and it moves to Mombasa. From the trucks, it moves to Nairobi. And then there it finds its way to the warehouses or the go-downs. Here the containers are opened at the go-down, and again, other jobs created for the offloaders, the loaders, the security guys. And here's where the goods are sort of sorted out. Which one is camera, which one is grade this and this. And then from there, they're transported again out to the market, the soko, which is step 6. Here again, there are employees at the market, the bebas, the offloaders, the cart pullers, the guys for them mkokoteni, the security guys, the loaders. As you can see, there's a lot of informal job creation throughout this value chain. And from the soko, it now goes to the wholesalers or it goes to the finishers. So something about secondhand clothes is that they can be reused. So some garments come in and they're made into kids' jumpsuits, or they're repurposed to fit or to be, they're made into a totally new creation. So this is what goes to step 7 to the tailors, and then it's ironed, and then it's finally sold. Then on the other end, it could either go to the finishers or it could go to the wholesalers. Here's where now the bills are broken out and it's sent to the brokers. The brokers now move on to the big retailers. And these big retailers are the ones who now organize this trade in like the rural areas, the urban areas, and they get it straight to the consumer, either through exporting or now again through a sub-retailer. So again, something to note is that we are not only consumers of second-hand clothes and shoes, but we're also exporters of the same. And you see some of our second-hand clothes and shoes go to Congo, Brazzaville, DRC, Somalia, Zambia, Lesotho, and many more. We'll explain in the next slides. And it's either it goes to the exporters or it goes to another sub-retailer, step 12. And this person now sells to the consumer, or it goes directly to the consumer. So this is you and I here, sorting out clothes, picking out items at the soko, and now you know how your shoes or your clothes get to you at the market. In the next slide, we look at household expenditures on clothing and footwear over the last 3 months. This is data from 2015-2016. And as soon as this report was released, this number 91.5% was, let me say, miscommunicated or misinterpreted. And it doesn't mean that 91.5% of all households buy Mitumba products worth 1,000 shillings and below. No, that's not what it means. It means that, so the new purchases and their second-hand purchases. So the second-hand purchases are what we're calling the Mitumba, and the new purchases are new. They're new. And out of these new purchases, 74.5% of the households that buy new clothes worth 1,000 shillings or less. And the remaining 25.5% of households that purchase new clothes and shoes buy them at a price above 1,000 shillings. And the 91.5% is second-hand purchases that are 1,000 shillings or below 1,000 shillings. So it's not all households, but it's households that purchase second-hand second-hand clothes and shoes that purchase at a price less than 1,000 Kenya shillings. And the remaining 8.5% purchase second-hand clothes above 1,000 shillings, clothes and shoes. So this just shows that there is demand for, I don't want to say cheaper, but lower priced clothes and shoes, because you can see more than 74% and for either new or second-hand clothes and shoes that are 1,000 shillings or less. And predominantly more of them are opting for second-hand clothes. I don't know, maybe it's because they are durable, I'm not sure, but there is demand for second-hand clothes and shoes 1,000 shillings and below. Now, you remember in the slide on the value chain, we spoke about how some of the Mitumba products Kenya produces are exported. So in this slide, we have the leading importers of one articles into Kenya, and the next part B is other countries where Kenya exports one articles to. So as we all imagine, the first one is China. You can see it's like 6.91 billion Kenya shillings. And this is based on 2017 data. About 40.8% of the one articles into Kenya come from China, 10% from Pakistan, 9.3 from Canada, 7.1 from the UK, and it goes on and on. Even from Oman, there's 1.7%. From Ireland, 0.4% of one articles come in. In terms of exports, we are also exporters of one articles, and surprisingly, even Germany is one of the export destinations. 12.6% of one articles leaving Kenya go to Germany. Some go to Rwanda, the United Republic of Tanzania, UAE, Zambia, Mexico, Zimbabwe, and the list goes on and on. And this is 93%. Sorry. And 98% of this country's exports were made to about 20 countries. So we're not doing so badly ourselves. Within Africa, the leading importers of one articles, which are African countries, were Tanzania and South Africa. I think it's good that we are both importing and exporting, and we're not only exporting locally, but even outside the continent. And finally, so we've talked about the legal aspect of Mitumba trade, what are the politics, the economics, the value chain, but what are the environmental implications of secondhand clothes? We did some research and found that for every 100 collected clothing items, 60 would be reused, 30 would be recycled, and 10 would be disposed of. And this this goods that would be reused, recycled, once purchased, 100 of the secondhand clothes would save between 60 to 85 new garments. And what it takes to make a single garment is water, it takes energy, it takes human capital. And saving on 60 to 85, the cost of each of those would make a huge difference. The secondhand clothes and shoes market also reduces global warming because, as we've said, it saves up to like 60 to 85 new garments for the purchase of 100 secondhand clothes, which means you're not going to the extent of producing all this through factories and, carbon emissions. We are reducing global warming. Then the reduction in consumption of clothes is yet another way to minimize clothing waste, earlier estimated to be about 10% of clothing items. So waste is not only your paper bag outside, it's not only the food waste, even clothes are disposed of, as we've seen here. In every 100 clothing items, 10 would be disposed of. And these ones that had been disposed would be about like 10%. And the secondhand clothes and shoes market reduces this type of waste. It's a form of waste management, making the planet a cleaner place to be in. So my colleague Kemboy will take you through the conclusions. Thank you.
So, in conclusions, because one of the questions we were supposed to answer was whether this COVID spread, to look at the emerging literature, because literature on COVID was coming in out, and whether that has been tied back to the spread of COVID, and that is what that because of the procedure that is during that cleaning, the treatment of those secondhand clothes, and that, for example, some of the things like that treatment process does not actually lead to serious scientific evidence, because we could not find literature on that this COVID spread from used clothes. Another reflection is that the extent of the Mitumba trade demand, Mitumba trade market, it's a reflection of that demand, styling preferences, and employment opportunities. What we mean here is that this is because if, for example, there are people who are anti-Mitumba because they think it's lack of dignity or those actual comments. The most strong economic argument for that we see from that is that from Mitumba trade is that this is a reflection of income. It's a demand side problem, not a supply side problem. So it's not because that Mitumba traders are there because the market is infinitely there, like it's just there. It's because the income levels. It's a reflection of the income problem. The third conclusion is that there's weak evidence from Mitumba consumption that it reduces purchases of new or local textiles. I wanted to show something from this chart, that if you look at this chart, the differences in purchases of new purchases or second-hand clothes, and you see that that variation, and it shows you something from, because, for example, for something to be a substitute for a new purchases to be substitutes to second-hand purchases, they have to have almost similar kind of that elasticity of demand. But you see very stark differences that 26% of new purchases are 1,000 and above, while at the same time 8.5% of new purchases are 1,000 and above in that year, and this is on a quarterly basis. So it shows you that this is something that is the two products are not substitutes. So one consumption of either one more of one does not reduce the demand for the other, and that makes our fourth conclusion, and that Mitumba and local textile manufacturers are different markets. So, and the point is this, that these are different markets and they're on different value chains. And the different markets, different value chain, different products per se, and these are not substitutes. So that is the biggest. So it's a reflection of the market. So most people think that the market, the Mitumba market, is something that is artificially created. You hear so many myths and misconceptions. Looking at the data reported by Kenya National Bureau of Statistics annually, looking at the Kenya integrated, the surveys from the Kenya Integrated Budget Outsource Service, that is where we find that conclusion. The final one is that Mitumba is not a threat to environment, and that one has been. I think the explanation for that is evident, that when you reuse, when what happens when you reuse clothes, when you recycle, and so that one Anna has explained sufficiently. So, and the last thing that I just want to say is that before, and I know most of the people remember this, before liberalization in the early 90s, the liberalization of economies in 1990s, and this one that allowed now new regulations came in that allowed Mitumba to be brought in. Everyone remembers, for me, from where I come from, I remember that from childhood, I could see many people who had patched up clothes that someone would repair and repair and repair. But as Mitumba was available, you don't see much of that pervasively in the market of that. So this is it's a market improvement that welfare. The more when people are clothed, there's more. The welfare is improved. Thank you. Kwame, back to you.
All right. Okay. Thanks a lot, ladies and gentlemen. We've had a presentation by my three colleagues, Leo, Maureen, and Anna Grace. So Leo took us through the legal regime and the politics of the regulation of Mitumba trade in Kenya, in which we drew a kind of power map showing what interests and what influence various actors in the sector broadly have, and what some of the interests that a policy regarding textiles generally, but also used textiles would have to contend with rather. And then we had the economic analysis of the second-hand clothes industry in Kenya. Maureen took us through basically the amount they're spending. The data is a bit old, yes, we agree, it's 2017, but it's telling us how much families, remember, the household level spent on a regular quota in clothing in Kenya. And the first thing it showed us is that basically Kenyans spend 2.5% of GDP in clothes, and that's both used and rather that's both Mutumba and new clothes. So that's basically all the spending locally, whether locally manufactured or imported. Which number, about 2.5%, is typical for a country of Kenya's size, and that suggests something that I think is also very important from this study, which is that the main barrier to expenditure on the textiles industry, whether manufactured new clothes or whether imported clothes, is just basically an income one. So as far as the income levels go, Kenyans actually spend on clothes in a way that's much typically matched, properly matched on a comparative basis to the income levels that Kenyans have. There are countries that go all the way up to 7. The US, of course, crashed to about 3 last year because of COVID. But in general, countries at about $2,000, $5,000 and below spend just about the same amount as we do on clothing, which is an important factor for whether the real question is whether to grow incomes or whether to actually block. So Mutumba is a solution for the fact, for some people is a solution for the fact that incomes vary. And then Anna Grace took us through basically a value chain. I think that's one of the things none of us was aware of, and we just sat back to actually try. Now, we did not get the data to be able to extract at which point most of the value is added. That would be useful, but that's a study for another day. What we wanted to say was just basically what's the value chain. And there's no way Mithuba is going to come all the way from the port of Mombasa, come all the way down here and go to the markets in Busia, the markets in Busia, Iten, or other parts of this country, unless somebody is adding value or some value is being created so that the final consumer gets it. And so we've seen something that, while we call it the Mitumba trade, just like every other business, it's not a standalone business. It's connected in many links back and forth to other sectors, whether transport, logistics, even labor, even some semi-manufacturing, where people actually bring in, as my colleague mentioned, sweatshirts from colleges or sweatshirts from other parts of the world, which are then washed and then repurposed into jumpsuits for kids or into other forms of jumpers with local styling taken into account. So that was quite a lesson for us. And then we looked at the environmental implications of secondhand clothes, and among the things we saw is that I think people talk about circular consumption and manufacturing and all that. And one of the things that we all know is that once clothes have been manufactured, or whether they're shoes, their life cycle and the way the consumption takes place is important for environmental concerns. So there's an argument that can be made, and it's a very solid argument, that Mitumba specifically doesn't have a huge environmental footprint that's harmful to the environment of the ecosystem. So that's, I think, one other thing that speaks for it. And then we have the 4 conclusions which were made by Leo. So that's basically, but one of the things that I'd like to conclude before we go for questions is the thing that is most salient in my view from this study by my colleagues is, look, if you look at that split, which I think it's my colleague Maureen who went about it, I think it's a very significant one. One, first, we understand the income levels that exist at all levels, all households in Kenya. So that was a really, really big survey conducted by the National Bureau of Statistics, and we just queried it for the purposes of this study. And among the things we are finding is that for both urban and rural people, we did not split the data by income levels, but we split it by income, by urban and rural people. Urban people and rural people buy both new and used clothes and footwear. So that's the first point that's important. So it's not like a rural or an urban niche. Mutumba clothes are not a rural or urban niche. So that's the more important. The second point that I just been re-emphasized is that for both new and used clothes, urban people consume more of new and also used clothes as well. And it's clear to us what the intervening variable is. It's income. So that income levels determine how much people buy of clothes that are new and how much people buy of both. And because relatively in Kenya, incomes in urban areas are a little higher and markets are more competitive, many people in urban areas therefore have more variety or rather competition in terms of both the new and the used clothes, which is an interesting one. So it's not necessarily, Mutumba is not ultimately an urban one. But what varies is how much money people in urban areas and rural areas spend. On both sides, they spend the least. And I think the figure that has been emphasized by my colleague Anna Grace, which is about the 1,000 one, which is true. We see it being circulated in the internet, and it's embarrassing to us because what people read from it is not exactly what it says, because it's a partial, which is this, that for those who purchase clothes, yes, this chart. So you can see that the reason we divided it by 1,000 shillings was to ask ourselves, what's the appropriate cutoff for showing how people spend money on both new purchases and secondhand clothes? And you can see that for new purchases, 74.5% of them are less than 1,000 shillings. And for second-hand purchases, 91.5% are less than 1,000 shillings, or 1,000 shillings or less. Telling you that whichever, whether you're looking at new or second-hand clothes, Kenyans are chasing some value, or there's some cutoff upon which they do. But on the whole, clothes worth 1,000 shillings are actually rarer. So basically, for clothes worth 1,000 shillings, for new purchases, it's only 25% of the total purchase. And then for second-hand purchases, it's even much, much less. So few people, much fewer households buy, because this is 8.5% of households who bought clothes at 1,000 shillings or more. So this figure in itself is quite revealing. And I hope if you take anything else, I think what it suggests to us that yes, with strict income levels, or rather with income at constrained income, the second-hand clothes and new purchases actually provide options that people can, depending on what their budgets are, but also what the specific demands would be. I'd like now to bring this to the question and answer session. And I'd start with a question that's here from Mushai Kunia. He says, I think he's querying some data saying that, Simon, please switch off your camera. Simon, please switch off your camera. Okay, thank you. So Mushai says that 40%, that I think he's questioning that 40% of used clothes from China look suspicious. Could there be new products disguised as used? I think that's a question for Leo, and well, all of you can just look at it. I think it's that figure that shows where the imports come from and where the exports come from. So when you place that back, then you can answer that question. I think there was a second question as well by someone else, but I can't see. Guys, if you have a question, please raise your hand, or then I'll give you an opportunity to ask for it. So in the meantime, let me ask Anna Grace and Leo and Maureen to respond to the question from Mushai as I get the other questions. Anna Grace and Leo, please go.
Yeah, so we got that data from the UN Comtrade, and they use what they call the HS code, the harmonization schedule, which is that 9-digit code. And what we see, that number is verifiable. The thing I'd like to add is that I think that is a question to ask the enforcement, the people in charge of enforcement at the border points, because it's easy to tell what is secondhand and what is new. Because remember, when we were undertaking the study, there was a conversation between us and the key informants now, who are the Mitumba traders, and they have various grades of what is considered second-hand clothes. Yeah, that's a response from me.
All right, Anna and Maureen, do you have any responses? Do you want to add something before I ask the rest of the question?
No, we don't have anything else to add.
Okay, fine. So let me ask them Shai, I hope that's useful, and perhaps you can provide that data as a link at the end of this study, so everybody can verify it for themselves. Shelmith Mugu has asked a question. I think this again goes to Anna and Maureen. Interesting that we also export used clothes. From the study, are these exports locally made, or are they initially imported, used, then exported? So that's from Shelmith. So you guys can answer that. Then there's a guest by the name of AK, which is basically, I hope, some initials. So he asks, what are the factors affecting the growth of local textile, yet they are different markets with Mitumba clothes? And then has the local textile manufacturing promoted the growth of cotton industry in the country? So those are two questions. One, they're actually three. So the first one is basically from the study. Are these exports of Mitumba from Kenya locally made before they're exported, or they're imported and then re-exported. And then AK asks, what are the factors affecting the growth of local textile if there are different markets with Mitumba clothes? And has the local textile market promoted the growth of cotton within Kenya? So I'll start with Maureen.
Okay, thank you, Kwame. I'll answer Shelmith's question. The one that she's asking whether the exports are made locally or are they imported, used, then exported. From the value chain that Anna explained of how the clothes are taken from the port to the consumer, that's you and me. There's the sorting out process from the reports where some clothes are consumed locally and some are exported, whereby we have tailors who are involved also in the value chain, who remake the clothes and then we can maybe export them. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Right, Anna Grace and Leo, any responses? Shall we?
Yeah. So when we were looking at this data, the way the UN Comtrade classifies it is this: they say imports, and then exports, and then what they call now re-exports. So what happens is, and this is what we found out, is that these are second-hand clothes, which are actually it's brought in as in bale, then they are sorted out into various categories. Some of them are finished off, that the ones that require stitching and the kind of the finishing for and then now sent to those destinations. Some of them that, for example, like the ones that goes back to Germany. I need to explain something. That part of our study was we looked at linkages for this sector to other sectors, and one of the linkages that we found out in literature, and also is that they form part of the value chain into the cleaning industry. So if you looked at those rags that you use to do the cleaning, it needs a very different kind of form of material, and that material has to have one of, so they use one articles, and that could explain that export, that re-export, for example, to destinations like Germany. Yeah, so that's my response to Shedmate. My addition. On the question, Kome, can I go ahead to the next?
Yes, go ahead.
By AK. So, and Kome, you can still add something to this. Is that when we were looking at, so one of the questions we were asking ourselves during the study is to look at, we looked at some of the best countries, like the best where the textile industry form a sufficient part of the economy. So we looked at country, an example in this case, and Kome can add to this, Bangladesh. So the imports, I think they were exporting close to 40 or $50 billion, but what they imported as second-hand clothes it was a little bit higher, close to almost 10 billion. So, and this for us, and that is where we could see that the demonstration, if you look at those countries that have that specialization for textile, like for example Bangladesh, Indonesia, or Turkey, you will see that the second-hand clothes form a bigger section of the imports and exports. So what confirms to us is that the local textile industry and the Mitumba, and this is the preference we took, and this is the more preferred one, is that these are separate value chains. So when they are separate value chains, so for example, you take cotton for new clothes. If you're taking cotton and then transforming that to a final material. And then, so these are two different sectors that can grow concurrently. So another thing is whether that, as the second part of your question, so what affects the growth of local textiles is that globally, because this is a competition, unless the Kenyan cotton, the manufacturers here are able to match up global competition, that is when the local textile industry will grow. Because the market you are targeting is, for example, market in other countries like emerging markets, developed markets, the developed countries, and unless you are able to match competitors now, like in Bangladesh or Turkey, and this means that you are bringing those costs of cotton, growing cotton, the costs of production, the cost of that local textile industry will not be able to grow. So the second question will need some considerable amount of to look now at the data, but the local textile industry has not promoted cotton, because I think part of cotton that is used here, especially for those industries in the EPZ, is brought in as intermediate material and then finished here, and then they are now exported.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anna Grace, should I go to the next question?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, fine. So we have another question from Joanne, and she says, your analysis therefore confirms that Mutumba trade has no adverse impact on textile manufacturing value chain. I think that's a question, so you guys can respond to it as well. I haven't seen any other questions or any other hands up, so let me hear that before then we can come back for another round of questions. So Anna Grace, Joanne Onyango is asking, your analysis therefore confirms that Mutumba trade has no adverse impact on textile manufacturing value chain. So let's hear your responses.
Thank you for that question. By adverse impact, do you mean like it's pushing the textile manufacturing industry out of the market? And to that, I'd say no, because the numbers show that they're actually competitive. Let me just go back to the presentation. So in this slide, the new purchases, I'm assuming, are inclusive of the textile manufacturing products. And it's not that when people buy secondhand purchases, there's no one else buying new purchases. They're still being bought. They're still competitive, but it doesn't mean that we have to scrap out Mitumba trade in entirety to make room for the textile manufacturing industry in Kenya. They can still compete, and I don't think there are any adverse effects on the textile manufacturing industry. Thank you.
Okay. Leo and Maureen, any additions?
Yeah. So
okay.
Go ahead, Maureen.
Okay, thank you, Leo. Okay, what I wanted to add to what Anna Grace has said, the Mitumba and the textile industry, for both the secondhand and the new purchases, they are complementary industries, and I don't think it's a threat to the textile industry, if that's what you mean, because looking at the income levels of majority of the Kenyans, they prefer the Mutumba over the new purchases. But from the data, we can see that households are purchasing from both sides. So I don't think it's a threat. Thank you.
Okay, Leo?
Yeah. So, and just to add, when we looked at the US data, and actually most of the countries that when we were scoping through, is that even those countries that are developed, that have high incomes, for example, like of between like $30,000 to $60,000 per year, is their per capita income is 60, like from 30 to 60,000. That still their secondhand clothes for clothing and footwear and even books and other things. The sectors are still bigger. The extent of that market is still bigger. So it's the effect on the manufacturing is still not there. Back to you, Kwame.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if you answered the question. I mean, Mushai's question about 40% used clothes from China looks suspicious. Could there be new products disguised as used? We need to find out that and actually unpack that even further, because I think what he's suggesting is that we need to be sure that when the 40% of the used clothes come from China. So if you think about 40% of the used clothes coming from China, that's 8,000 containers. So 40% of that would be 1,600 containers, right? No, 3,200 containers. And are we sure that all those containers are necessarily from, used clothes, or might they be new products disguised as used? I think that's an essential thing to say, to consider, because if that is the way, and I have no evidence then it would suggest some kind of distortion in the data, but also and has implications even for revenue collection and stuff like that. But I think that's worth looking at. Though the way this trade data is entered, it's usually entered according to the international classifications. And then it would have to be verified. So one of the things we need to say is, to what extent does the Kenya Revenue Authority verify that clothes are what is stated they are? And I think they do, because one thing that we'd add is that we know that there's been a ban. While there's no ban, the ban on importation of clothes was suspended, so imports are allowed with the new rules. But we know there are bans on undergarments, again, based on moral considerations or just the tastes that Kenyans have. Many Kenyans think that, and there's a solid argument that people shouldn't buy undergarments. We can trade other clothes, but undergarments are far too personal and closer to the skin, and we should not have to buy used ones. So I think there's a level of verification that takes place, but I think the inspection and verification is a useful thing for us. So Shai will follow up that and see if we can find an answer for how the inspection is done. Along that value chain, maybe one of the things we should add is how the inspection and the verification of the source and the content of the containers is. I see no further questions, ladies and gentlemen. So what I'll do at this point is, unless somebody raises their hands, use the chat box to raise your hand or anything else, I'll ask Leo, the three to make their final comments. And so I'll start with Maureen. I'll reverse the order. I'll start with Maureen, I'll go to Anna Grace, and then I'll finish up with Leo. Any final comments that you might have? Please go ahead. Let's start with Maureen.
Okay, I'd like to thank everyone. And yeah, the question that Joanne asked, whether Mitumba is a threat to the textile industry, which we all believe is a threat, according to the government regulations. I don't think it's a threat, and we should embrace the Mitumba trade. Thank you.
Anna?
Thank you all for attending, for your questions too. About the exports from China, imports from China, we will look into it further and give you a solid answer on that. Thank you.
All right, Leo.
For me, I want to talk from a legal and regulation standpoint, and to say that I think the intellectual firepower that should go into, for example, in crafting regulations or public education on something, for example, as sensitive as this Mutumba trade, should be more and advance more. And I think this should be the right course, and so that we inform people based on evidence and facts, and not because of the popular opinions or what we think, what is perceptions about something. So thank you, and thank you everyone for attending. To you, Kwame.
Okay. Thanks everyone. So as I conclude these things, let me just say this. I think AK asked about whether there's a connection to the cotton industry in Kenya. And remember, what we try to follow is that the textiles trade globally is actually a value chain where you find manufacturing taking place in places which are the most efficient. So you find that some of the highest exporters of clothing, or textiles or clothing materials, or textiles generally, are countries that do not grow cotton, provided they are able to compete and actually provide value by high-skilled labor force. They have the best infrastructure in which to do that, and of course they have the logistics and the support. So one of the reasons we demonstrated the value chain is to suggest that for an industry to do well, often it's not just one thing that's working, it's a series of interlocking sectors with input at all levels adding value towards the final consumer, and to generate that supply capability. So it is still possible that Kenya's textiles industries would do better if it was linked to Kenya's cotton value chain, but that is not necessary. That's not to say the cotton industry is not important. It's just to say that it is still possible to produce high-level textiles, partly because the nature of these industries is that some imports come in as intermediate imports, and then they are finished goods and then re-exported. As you can see, Kenya also imports some and then re-exports. So the cotton industry, if it is competitive, will help the textile manufacturing both sides, basically because some of the finishing that takes place on imported clothes, or rather used clothes, actually are using new materials. So you use new textiles to, say, for instance, a zipper, which you add to a repurposed jacket, and then export it back into other parts of this country and other places. So there's a value addition that requires an input. And some of Mutumba is actually not a final consumption product in some places, but it's actually an intermediate product which is then done. So that can happen regardless of whether the cotton industry in Kenya works. And I think the textile or manufacturing sector would depend on that intermediate input. But at the same time, if the cotton industry was not efficient or was not sufficiently competitive, because competitiveness is the name of this game, and the textiles industry is one of the most competitive globally because many countries want to use it as a platform for developing manufacturing. So obviously we have an imperative to actually ensure that Kenya's industry is at this level is competitive. I think that's an imperative. So yes, it could be part of the inputs, but it's also possible that manufacturers will find other avenues if it isn't. So we cannot hamstring manufacturing by insisting that they must use local cotton, but it's also useful to actually provide an incentive for local cotton to say, look, Kenya hopes to develop a huge manufacturing industry in which textiles production would be part of it. And so if the cotton produced in Kenya was of sufficient quantity, the best quality, and also competitively, then definitely it would have to be. And the final thing is that the basis of this paper was not necessarily to put the local manufacturing in competition against Mitumba. Our view, first starting from an institution that supports trade, is that if a Kenyan has demand, whether as a trader or as a final consumer, and can import goods that are of value for them and they pay all the necessary levies, then obviously they should not be constrained unnecessarily. So for that reason, we do not think that the Mutumba industry and the local manufacturing industries are necessarily in competition. As a matter of fact, when we launched this report a couple of weeks back, the Anne Kagwe, who's the presidential advisor on the development of SMEs, micro and small enterprises, actually said that she sees that the possibility, this is what she suggested, that the possibility that actually Mutumba trade could be integrated at some level, at some basic level, as input providers or as finishers or as some level with some level of value addition in the sense that they could take new products from Kenya and actually add value and then repurpose it for export into that market, suggests that it is true that they are not necessarily alternatives to each other, and that the development of local textile manufacturing must be at the expense of the Mitumba industry, and also that there are 2 million people across that value chain that we suggested that own and do businesses of different sizes, many of them very small, but they still value that they add, and that should be kept. So we'd advise you to look at the paper. My colleagues will provide a link of the paper, the presentations that we've done and that we've made here today. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask us, please send it to Ask Your Economist at ieakenya.or.ke, and we'll give you an answer to it quickly. So we thank you for attending the meeting today. We'd just like to let you know that tomorrow in the afternoon we have a media event, which will be social media, 1 hour from 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 2:15 in the afternoon. We'll be presenting these charts and answering questions from the media and other people. So we have a tweet chat tomorrow at 2 o'clock. So please, if you have some time, do attend it. And even if you don't, please follow the hashtag, which will be provided later. So thank you very much and have a good morning. Thanks a lot. Once again, I thank my colleagues, Maureen, Leo, and Anna Grace for working on the report and making sure that it's available for us today. Thank you very much and have a good morning.